Marcus Fletcher stood in front of the large mirror in the employee bathroom of Le Maison Rouge, adjusting his black bow tie for the third time. His fingers moved with practiced precision as he smoothed down his crisp white shirt and checked for any imperfections in his appearance. At 45 years old, he had spent the last 15 years working at this high-end Beverly Hills restaurant, and he took great pride in being their most experienced waiter. The bathroom door opened, and Jimmy, a young busboy, poked his head in. "Marcus, chef wants everyone in the kitchen for the pre-service meeting, like right now." Marcus gave his reflection one final look before following Jimmy to the kitchen. The restaurant would open in 30 minutes, and as always, Marcus wanted everything to be perfect. The smell of fresh bread and simmering sauces filled the air as the kitchen staff gathered around the main prep station. Chef Antonio, a short Italian man with salt and pepper hair, clapped his hands to get everyone's attention. "Listen up, everyone. Tonight is not just another Friday night. We have 3 separate groups of VIP guests coming in." He paused for effect, his thick accent becoming more pronounced with excitement. "Table 7 has the producer of that new superhero movie. Table 12 has the CEO of Pacific Bank. And," he checked his notepad, "we're expecting a very special guest to inspect the private dining room, but management wants to keep that quiet for now." Marcus felt his chest swell with importance. This was exactly the kind of evening where his experience shined. He knew how to handle Hollywood producers and banking executives. They wanted attentive but discreet service, expensive wine recommendations, and just the right amount of professional small talk. As the staff dispersed to their stations, Marcus began his pre-service routine. He checked each of his assigned tables, making sure the white tablecloths were perfectly straight and wrinkle-free. He inspected every piece of silverware for water spots, holding them up to the light and replacing any that didn't meet his standards. The wine glasses got special attention. He even gave them a final polish with his special cloth that left no lint behind. Sarah, a newer waitress, watched him with amazement. "I don't know how you do it, Marcus. You treat every night like we're serving the president." "That's because every guest deserves perfect service," Marcus replied, though in his heart, he knew he had his own hierarchy of guests. The ones who knew about food and wine, who dressed appropriately, and who understood the unwritten rules of fine dining. These were the guests he truly enjoyed serving. At exactly 5:30 p.m., the doors opened. The early dinner crowd started arriving, mostly older wealthy couples who preferred to dine before the evening rush. Marcus moved between his tables with graceful efficiency, his posture perfect, his movements elegant. You could tell just by looking at guests which wines they might prefer, and his suggestions usually earned him appreciative nods and generous tips. Around 7:00 p.m., the restaurant was humming with activity. The sound of gentle classical music mixed with the soft clink of silverware and the murmur of conversations. The lighting was perfect, dim enough for ambience but bright enough to read the menu. Marcus had just finished taking an order from the movie producer's table when he noticed something unusual through the front windows. A group of people had pulled up in several expensive cars, but their appearance made Marcus frown. Despite their obviously costly clothes, they weren't wearing the usual formal attire he expected from their high-end clientele. He watched as the valet parkers rushed to open their car doors, and his frown deepened when he saw their casual clothing. "They must be lost," he muttered to himself, straightening his jacket. "This isn't that kind of establishment." The restaurant's general manager, Mr. Thompson, suddenly appeared beside him, looking unusually nervous. "Marcus, I need you to handle the private dining section tonight. Whatever you do, make sure everything is perfect." Marcus nodded confidently. If anyone could maintain the restaurant's standards, it was him. He had no idea that this regular Friday night was about to become the most memorable shift of his career, and not in the way he expected. As he walked toward the private dining section, Marcus noticed the group from the cars being led inside by the hostess. He straightened his shoulders and lifted his chin slightly. He would make sure they understood exactly what kind of establishment Le Maison Rouge was, even if he had to do it through subtle hints and raised eyebrows. After all, standards were standards, and Marcus Fletcher was their guardian. Marcus watched with growing disapproval as the group made their way through the main dining room. Their leader was a tall, slim man wearing designer streetwear. Expensive, yes, but completely wrong for Le Maison Rouge's formal atmosphere. The man's hat was pulled low, and diamond chains glinted around his neck. Behind him followed four other people, all dressed similarly in high-end casual clothing. The hostess, Jenny, led them toward the private dining section with a nervous smile. Marcus noticed how other diners turned to stare, some with recognition in their eyes, though he couldn't understand why. All he saw was a group that clearly didn't belong in his carefully maintained world of fine dining. "Good evening," Marcus said stiffly as the group reached the private dining area. "I'll be your server tonight." He kept his voice professional, but his eyes lingered disapprovingly on their clothing. The tall man smiled easily, seemingly unbothered by Marcus's cold welcome. "What's good tonight, cuz?" he asked in a laid-back tone that made Marcus wince internally. The voice was distinctive, smooth, and melodious, but Marcus was too focused on his disapproval to place it. "Sir," Marcus began, emphasizing the formal address, "our chef prepares an excellent tasting menu that might be more accessible." He hadn't meant to stress the word accessible quite so much, but his frustration was starting to show. One of the group members, a well-dressed woman who appeared to be some kind of assistant, raised her eyebrows at Marcus's tone. She leaned forward as if to say something, but the tall man raised his hand slightly, and she sat back, exchanging knowing looks with the others. "Nah, let me see that wine list first," the man said, still maintaining his relaxed demeanor. "I heard you all got some nice burgundies in recently." Marcus blinked in surprise. The restaurant had indeed just received a rare shipment of exceptional Burgundy wines, but this information wasn't widely known. He handed over the leather-bound wine lists with slightly less stiffness, though his posture remained rigid. The man began discussing vintage years and vineyard locations with an expertise that caught Marcus off guard. Still, he couldn't shake his initial judgment. When the man requested a specific 1982 bottle, Marcus couldn't help himself. "Sir, that particular wine is quite expensive," he said carefully, as if speaking to a child. "Perhaps I can suggest something more suitable?" A subtle tension fell over the table. The assistant cleared her throat meaningfully, and another member of the group shook his head slightly. But their leader just chuckled, a deep, familiar sound that tugged at Marcus's memory. "Don't worry about the price, my man," the tall man said, finally lifting his head enough for the restaurant's soft lighting to fully illuminate his face. "I know a thing or two about fine wine." Marcus still didn't recognize him, though something about the man's long face and gentle eyes seemed familiar. The waiter's confusion must have shown on his face because one of the group members muttered under his breath, "He really doesn't know who you are, boss." "Sir, I apologize, but we do have a dress code," Marcus pressed on, gesturing to the small sign near the entrance that listed the restaurant's requirements. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at one of the livelier establishments down the street." The suggestion hung in the air like a lead weight. The assistant was now typing furiously on her phone, while another group member appeared to be holding back laughter. The tall man simply leaned back in his chair, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Why don't you tell me about your chef's specialties?" he asked, smoothly changing the subject. "I heard some interesting things about the new tasting menu." Marcus struggled to maintain his professional demeanor. Everything about this group challenged his notions of what Le Maison Rouge's clientele should be, yet they showed surprising knowledge of the restaurant's offerings. As he began describing the menu, he noticed Mr. Thompson, the general manager, hovering nervously nearby, watching their interaction with an increasingly worried expression. What Marcus didn't know was that his perfectly ordered world was about to be turned upside down. The man he was treating with barely concealed disdain wasn't just another improperly dressed guest. He was about to learn that sometimes the biggest lessons come from the most unexpected teachers. As the evening progressed, Marcus's attitude toward the group in the private dining section grew increasingly cold. He couldn't shake the feeling that their presence somehow diminished the restaurant's prestigious atmosphere, despite their obvious knowledge of fine dining and wines. "I suppose sir would like to hear about our dessert menu now?" Marcus asked with barely hidden sarcasm, after clearing their main course plates. He had spent the last hour watching in dismay as they thoroughly enjoyed some of the restaurant's most expensive dishes, showing surprising knowledge about French cuisine. The tall man in the hat looked up at him with those calm, knowing eyes. "Actually, I got some suggestions about the dessert menu. That chocolate souffle you guys used to serve, that joint was fire. Why'd you take it off?" Marcus froze. The chocolate souffle had indeed been removed from the menu just 2 weeks ago, a decision that hadn't been publicly announced. He glanced nervously at Mr. Thompson, who was hovering nearby again, his forehead beaded with sweat. "I wasn't aware you were a regular customer," Marcus said stiffly, emphasizing the word regular in a way that clearly suggested doubt. The assistant at the table finally spoke up. "Perhaps, Marcus," she said, reading his name tag, "you should focus more on service and less on judgments." Her tone was professional but carried a sharp edge. But the tall man raised his hand again, that same casual gesture that somehow commanded immediate respect from his group. "Nah, let the man speak his mind. I'm curious what else he got to say about how we don't fit in here." The challenge was clear, but the man's tone remained surprisingly gentle. Marcus, however, was too caught up in his own prejudices to notice the warning signs, the nervous manager, the knowing looks, the guest's detailed knowledge of the restaurant's operations. "Well, sir," Marcus began, drawing himself up to his full height, "La Maison Rouge has certain standards. Our usual clientele expects a particular atmosphere, while your group's enthusiasm for fine dining is admirable. Perhaps an establishment more suited to your style would be more appropriate." The silence that followed was deafening. Even nearby tables seemed to grow quiet, as if sensing the tension. The tall man's entourage exchanged glances that mixed disbelief with amusement. Mr. Thompson looked like he might faint. "My style?" the tall man repeated softly, leaning forward slightly. For the first time, Marcus felt a flicker of uncertainty. There was something about the man's voice, a quiet authority that seemed oddly familiar. "Tell me more about these standards," the man continued, his voice smooth as silk, but carrying an undercurrent of challenge. "What exactly about my style doesn't meet them?" Marcus found himself stammering slightly, his usual confidence wavering. "Well, the dress code and your manner of speaking, it's just not what our regular patrons—" "Your regular patrons," the man interrupted gently, "come here for good food, good wine, and good service. Now, we've established I know my wines. Your chef just spent 20 minutes discussing his inspiration for that truffle risotto with me. So maybe," he paused, letting the words hang in the air, "it's just the service that's not meeting standards tonight." The assistant was now filming discreetly with her phone, while another member of the group whispered something that sounded suspiciously like this gonna blow up on social media. Marcus felt the first real stirring of fear in his stomach. He looked desperately at Mr. Thompson, but the manager was now engaged in an urgent whispered conversation with Chef Antonio, who had emerged from the kitchen looking both excited and terrified. I apologize if I caused any offense," Marcus managed to say, his voice losing its condescending edge. "Perhaps we got off on the wrong foot. Would you like to see that dessert menu now?" The tall man smiled, but it wasn't the reaction Marcus had hoped for. It was the smile of someone who knew something very important that you didn't yet. "Nah, I think it's time we had a different kind of conversation," the man said, finally reaching up to remove his hat. "Let's talk about who actually owns this restaurant, and why they sent me to check on how things were running tonight." Marcus felt the blood drain from his face as recognition finally, terribly, dawned. The next 30 minutes were the longest of Marcus's career. After his confrontation with the tall man, he retreated to the kitchen, trying to gather his thoughts. His hands shook slightly as he arranged dessert plates for another table, his usual precision failing him. "You really messed up this time," Jimmy the busboy whispered as he passed by. "Don't you know who that is out there? That's Snoop Dogg, man, and the word in the kitchen is he's not just a regular customer." Marcus nearly dropped the plate he was holding. Snoop Dogg, the famous rapper? But surely that couldn't be right. Yet as his mind raced back through the evening, pieces started falling into place. The distinctive voice, the confident wine knowledge, the way the staff had been acting so nervous. "Table 5 needs their check," Sarah called out, giving Marcus a sympathetic look. "Do you want me to take over the private dining section?" Marcus straightened his bow tie. "No," he said firmly, though his voice wavered slightly. "I'll handle my own tables." Even if he had made a terrible mistake, he would face it professionally. When he returned to the private dining section, the atmosphere had changed. Other diners were sneaking photos with their phones, having finally recognized the celebrity in their midst. The restaurant's sommelier was now at the table, engaged in an animated discussion about wine cellaring techniques with Snoop. Marcus approached with forced professionalism. "Will there be anything else this evening, sir?" he asked, his earlier condescension replaced with genuine anxiety. Snoop looked up at him, those calm eyes now holding a hint of amusement. Yeah, actually. Tell Chef I want to talk about that new menu he's been planning. The one that ain't been announced yet. Marcus felt his stomach drop. How did he know about the new menu? Only the owner and top management were supposed to know about those changes. He hurried to the kitchen, where he found Chef Antonio already preparing to go out. He knows about the new menu, Marcus said, his voice barely a whisper. Chef Antonio just nodded. Of course he knows. Idiota. He approved it last week. The chef's Italian accent grew stronger with his excitement. Do you not read your emails? The ownership change announcement? Marcus's mind raced. Ownership change? What emails? He had been so busy maintaining his standards that he'd ignored the staff meetings for the past month, assuming they were just routine updates. Back in the dining room, the situation was getting worse. Other servers were providing impeccable service to Snoop's table while Marcus stood frozen nearby, watching his perfectly ordered world crumble. The assistant who had been filming earlier was now showing Snoop something on her phone, probably the videos of Marcus's earlier behavior. Mr. Thompson appeared at Marcus's elbow, his face grave. Marcus, I tried to warn you. The dress code, it was updated last month. We're trying to be more inclusive while maintaining our quality. It was in the memo about the new ownership. New ownership? Marcus repeated weakly. Yes, the investment group that bought us. Snoop's investment group. He's been hands-on with all the changes, working with Chef Antonio on menu updates, improving the wine cellar. He knows more about French wine than most of our regulars. Marcus felt the room spin slightly. Every interaction from the evening played back in his mind, but now with horrible clarity. The casual comments about the soufflé, the wine knowledge, the inside information about menu changes, it all made sense. What? What should I do? Marcus asked, his voice small. Mr. Thompson sighed. Well, you could start by providing the kind of service this restaurant is actually known for, instead of the kind you think it should have. He's been watching how everyone treats regular customers compared to VIPs. That was part of why he came in dressed that way. Marcus nodded slowly, gathering his courage. He would have to face the consequences of his actions. As he approached the table again, he noticed Snoop was watching him with that same calm, measured gaze. The rapper's expression wasn't angry, but it held something that scared Marcus even more: disappointment. I believe you were going to tell me more about those standards, Snoop said quietly, and Marcus knew the real test of his professional career was about to begin. The private dining room had grown quiet. Other diners were pretending not to watch, but their eyes kept darting toward the unfolding scene. Marcus stood before Snoop Dogg's table, his hands clasped behind his back to hide their trembling. Mr. Thompson tells me you've worked here for 15 years, Snoop said, his voice carrying that same smooth, calm tone. That's a long time to build up certain expectations about how things should be. Marcus nodded stiffly, unable to find his voice. The restaurant's general manager had pulled him aside just moments ago for a rushed explanation that had turned his world upside down. Not only was Snoop Dogg the owner, but he had been secretly visiting different restaurants in his newly acquired restaurant group, checking on their culture and service standards. You know what's interesting? Snoop continued, gesturing for Marcus to take a seat at the table. It wasn't a request. When I was looking to buy this place, everyone told me about its amazing service, but they also mentioned something else, that it felt a little stuck in the past. A little too exclusive. The assistant who had been filming earlier placed her phone on the table, screen up. Marcus saw himself in the video, his face twisted with barely hidden disdain as he spoke to them earlier. The footage was damning. I don't know what to say, Marcus managed, his voice barely above a whisper. Then listen, Snoop said, leaning forward. 3 months ago, I bought this restaurant because I saw potential. Good food, good wine, good location. But I also saw something that needed to change. You know what that was? Marcus shook his head, though he was beginning to understand. The attitude, Snoop said simply. This idea that fine dining has to look a certain way, sound a certain way, that only certain people belong here. He gestured to his casual but expensive designer clothes. You saw this outfit and made a judgment. Never occurred to you that the owner might dress like this, did it? Around them, the restaurant continued its normal service, but Marcus could feel the eyes of his colleagues. Sarah was serving nearby tables with perfect professionalism, but he caught her sympathetic glances. Jimmy the busboy was hovering near the kitchen door, watching the scene unfold. "Chef Antonio," Snoop called out, and the chef approached quickly. "Tell Marcus about our conversation last week about the menu changes." The chef beamed with excitement. "Ah, yes, Snoop. He has incredible ideas. We are adding soul food influences to classical French dishes, a fusion menu that will surprise everyone. He knows more about flavor combinations than most chefs I've worked with." Marcus felt each word like a physical blow. While he had been judging based on appearances, Snoop had been revolutionizing the restaurant's future. The wine knowledge, the menu discussions, the souffle comment, it all made horrible sense now. "Mr. Thompson," Snoop called next, and the manager hurried over. "Show Marcus the new dress code policy." The manager pulled out a tablet and handed it to Marcus. The new policy was clear. Le Maison Rouge welcomes all guests who wish to enjoy exceptional dining experiences. While we maintain our commitment to quality and service, we recognize that style and elegance come in many forms. "That policy?" Snoop said, watching Marcus's face. "I wrote it myself, because this restaurant, it's not just about the food or the wine. It's about making people feel welcome. All people." Marcus looked up from the tablet, his face burning with shame. His entire career, he had prided himself on maintaining standards, but now he realized he had been maintaining barriers instead. "I understand if you want my resignation," Marcus said quietly. Snoop's expression changed then, showing something Marcus hadn't expected: thoughtfulness. "Now why would I want that? You're one of our most experienced servers. What I want is for you to learn from this. Question is, are you willing to learn?" The question hung in the air, and Marcus realized this wasn't just about his job anymore. It was about something much more important. His answer would determine not just his future at Le Maison Rouge, but the kind of person he wanted to be. Word spread quickly through Le Maison Rouge that evening. Servers whispered to each other between courses, busboys shared quick updates while clearing tables, and even the kitchen staff found excuses to peek through the doors at the private dining section. Everyone wanted to see how the situation with Marcus and their famous owner would unfold. Snoop Dogg had moved from the dining table to a more comfortable seating area in the private section. He was now engaged in an animated conversation with Chef Antonio about the restaurant's future, while his assistant took detailed notes on her tablet. Marcus stood nearby, his normally perfect posture slightly slumped, still processing everything that had happened. "Come near, man," Snoop called to Marcus, patting the chair next to him. "Let me show you something." Marcus approached cautiously and sat down. Snoop pulled out his phone and opened a photo gallery. The images showed him visiting different restaurants around the world, some fancy, some humble, all clearly chosen with purpose. "See this place?" Snoop said, pointing to a small, simple-looking restaurant. "Best French onion soup I ever had. Chef learned from his grandmother. Wears t-shirts and jeans every day." He swiped to another photo. "This spot in Paris? 3 Michelin stars. Owner walks around in sneakers because he believes comfort makes better food." Marcus looked at the photos with growing understanding. Each image challenged his long-held beliefs about what fine dining should look like. As Snoop continued sharing stories, other staff members gradually drew closer, attracted by his warm, inclusive way of speaking. "When I bought this place," Snoop continued, now addressing the small crowd that had gathered, "I didn't just buy a restaurant. I bought into a vision. We're going to change how people think about fine dining. It's not about being exclusive, it's about being excellent." Chef Antonio nodded enthusiastically. "This is why we are changing the menu. We keep the technique, the quality, but we add soul. Next week, we start testing new dishes. Marcus," he turned to the waiter, "we will need experienced staff to gather feedback." Marcus looked up in surprise. Despite everything that had happened, they still wanted his input. Snoop noticed his expression and smiled. "See, that's the thing about experience," he said. "It's valuable, but only if you're willing to let it grow. You got 15 years of knowledge about what works in this restaurant. Now you just gotta open your mind about who it works for." Sarah, who had been listening nearby, spoke up. "Marcus taught me everything I know about wine service," she said. "He's the best trainer we have, when he's not." She trailed off diplomatically. When I'm not being judgmental, Marcus finished for her, speaking for the first time in a while. His voice was quiet but clear. I've been so focused on maintaining what I thought were standards that I forgot why those standards exist. To provide the best experience for our guests. All our guests. Snoop nodded approvingly. Now that's what I'm talking about. Standards ain't about keeping people out, they're about lifting people up. Mr. Thompson appeared with a stack of new menus, draft versions for the staff to review. As he handed them out, Marcus saw the subtle changes. Traditional French dishes with modern twists, soul food inspirations woven throughout, and wine pairings that cross cultural boundaries. We're doing a staff tasting tomorrow, Snoop announced. Everyone's invited. Dress code, he grinned. Come as you are. The tension that had filled the restaurant all evening finally began to fade. Staff members laughed at the joke, and conversation started flowing more naturally. Even Marcus felt himself beginning to relax. One more thing, Snoop said, standing up. Tonight was a test, but not just of Marcus. It was a test of how this restaurant handles change. Some of you, he looked around the room, showed real leadership when you saw something wrong. Others stayed quiet. We're going to work on that too. As the evening wound down, Marcus watched Snoop move through the restaurant, greeting other guests, taking photos with fans, and treating every person, from the dishwashers to the wealthy regulars, with the same genuine respect. He realized that he wasn't just learning about fine dining tonight, he was learning about humanity. The restaurant was changing, and for the first time in his career, Marcus was ready to change with it. As the last customers left Le Maison Rouge for the evening, Snoop Dogg invited Marcus to join him in the wine cellar. The space had always been Marcus's favorite part of the restaurant, cool, quiet, and filled with carefully organized bottles. But tonight, it felt different. The labels he had memorized over 15 years suddenly seemed to tell new stories. You know why I picked this spot for our talk? Snoop asked, settling into one of the tasting area chairs. The cellar's soft lighting cast gentle shadows on the stone walls. Marcus shook his head as he sat down across from his new boss. The events of the evening had left him feeling both exhausted and strangely alert, like waking up from a long sleep. Because every bottle down here has a story, Snoop continued, standing up to pick a bottle from a nearby rack. Check this one out, Chateau Margaux, 1982. Classic, prestigious, expensive. But you know what makes it special? The vintage, the terroir, the winemaking technique. Marcus began automatically, falling back on his years of wine knowledge. Nah, man, what makes it special is that someone took grapes, just regular fruit growing in the dirt, and saw the potential for something extraordinary. Snoop placed the bottle carefully back in its spot. Just like I see potential in this restaurant, in you. Marcus felt his throat tighten. I don't understand. After how I acted tonight, how can you still want me here? Snoop smiled. Let me tell you a story. When I started in the music industry, people had all kinds of ideas about who I was, what I could do. They put me in a box, but I never let their prejudices define me. I learned about wine, about food, about business. I invested in things nobody expected me to understand. He paused, letting the words sink in. Sound familiar? Marcus nodded slowly. I did the same thing to you tonight. I saw what I expected to see, not what was actually there. Exactly, Snoop said. But here's the difference. You're willing to admit it. That's why I'm not firing you. Instead, I'm giving you a new job. Marcus looked up in surprise. A new job? Starting next week, you're going to help us train the staff on our new service standards. But first, Snoop raised a finger. You're going on a little trip. I want you to visit every restaurant in our group. Spend time in their dining rooms, their kitchens. Learn how different places define excellence. The idea both excited and terrified Marcus. Leave the familiar comfort of Le Maison Rouge, experience other styles of service. But as he thought about it, he realized that was exactly what he needed. There's this spot in Atlanta, Snoop continued. Soul food place. Chef there never went to cooking school, learned everything from her grandmother. But she plates food with more care and artistry than most fine dining spots. I want you to work with her for a week. Marcus found himself nodding. I'd like that. Then there's this taco truck in LA. Guy who runs it used to be a sommelier at a Michelin-starred restaurant. Quit to make street food, but pairs every taco with the perfect wine recommendation. Customers eat standing up, but they get a fine dining experience. As Snoop described more places, Marcus began to see a pattern. Each location broke some traditional rule of fine dining while perfecting others. Together, they painted a picture of what modern hospitality could be. But most importantly, Snoop said, his voice growing serious, "I want you to remember how it felt tonight. When you judged someone without knowing their story. When you learned you were wrong. That feeling? It's valuable. It's how we grow." Marcus looked around the wine cellar, at the bottles he had organized so carefully over the years. Each one, he realized, was like a person, unique, complex, worthy of being understood on its own terms. "I understand," he said finally, "and I'm ready to learn." Snoop stood up, extending his hand. "That's what I wanted to hear. Because fine dining? It's not about keeping traditions. It's about making new ones. You ready to help us do that?" As Marcus shook his boss's hand, he felt something shift inside him. The rigid rules he had lived by for so long began to feel less like walls and more like bridges waiting to be built. "Yes," he said firmly. "I'm ready." 6 months had passed since that unforgettable night at Le Maison Rouge. The restaurant had changed dramatically, and so had Marcus. On this busy Friday evening, he moved through the dining room with his usual grace, but there was something different about his demeanor, a warmth that hadn't been there before. "Marcus, my man." A guest in designer streetwear called out as he passed. It was James, a regular who had started visiting after the restaurant's transformation. "Bringing my business partners tonight. Need your recommendations for both wine and that new fusion menu." Of course, Marcus smiled genuinely, noting how naturally the casual interaction felt now. "Chef just added some amazing new dishes. Wait until you try the braised short rib with traditional French herbs and soul food spices." At a nearby table, a young couple in casual clothes looked nervous as they studied the wine list. 6 months ago, Marcus might have dismissed them. Now he approached with a welcoming smile. "First time at Le Maison Rouge?" he asked warmly. When they nodded, he continued, "Don't worry about the fancy names. Tell me what kind of wines you usually enjoy, and we'll find something perfect for you." The couple relaxed visibly, and Marcus spent a few minutes helping them discover a wine they'd love within their budget. As he walked away, he overheard the woman say, "This place isn't intimidating at all. Everyone said it was so fancy you wouldn't feel welcome." These moments made Marcus proud in a way that was completely different from his old pride in maintaining rigid standards. The restaurant was still excellent, perhaps even more so, but now it was excellent for everyone. "Training session in 10 minutes, Sarah reminded him as she passed by with a tray of dishes. Marcus nodded. After his journey visiting other restaurants in Snoop's group, he had become the lead trainer for new staff members, teaching them how to balance professionalism with accessibility. In the private dining room, a group of young tech entrepreneurs were celebrating a successful startup launch. They had arrived in a mix of hoodies and suits, carrying bottles of expensive champagne they brought from their office. The old Marcus would have been horrified. The new Marcus had worked with them to create a perfect celebration, combining their champagne with the chef's tasting menu. "Time for the new staff orientation," Mr. Thompson called softly. Marcus made his way to the wine cellar, where 5 new employees waited. This was his favorite part of the job now. "Welcome to Le Maison Rouge," he began, looking at their eager faces. "Let me tell you a story about what this place is really about. It started 6 months ago, when I had the worst and best night of my career." The new staff listened intently as Marcus shared his experience with Snoop Dogg. He had told this story many times now, using it as a teaching tool, and each time he found new insights in it. "Our standards aren't about excluding people," he explained. "They're about making sure every guest has an extraordinary experience, their way, not ours." After the orientation, Marcus checked his phone and smiled at a message from Snoop. The rapper-turned-restaurateur still dropped by regularly, sometimes in a suit, sometimes in streetwear, always bringing new ideas and energy to the place. "Hey, Marcus," Jimmy called out. The former busboy was now training as a sommelier, part of the restaurant's new employee development program. "Chef wants us all in the kitchen. He's testing some new fusion dishes for next month's menu." As Marcus walked through his beloved restaurant, he noticed things that would have been unthinkable 6 months ago: a famous actress in jeans and a t-shirt enjoying a quiet dinner in the corner. A group of artists sketching on the tablecloth, now covered with paper for exactly that purpose. A child being taught how to properly taste a mocktail by an enthusiastic bartender. The restaurant hadn't lost its excellence, it had redefined it. The wines were still perfectly stored, the service still impeccable, the food still extraordinary. But now, these things were accessible to anyone who wanted to experience them. As he pushed through the kitchen doors to join the staff tasting, Marcus smiled. He had learned that true hospitality wasn't about maintaining barriers. It was about breaking them down. And the Maison Rouge, under its unlikely owner's vision, had become a place where everyone could feel like they belonged.